My name is Kathleen Bush, and I'm the Manager of Community Relations here at King's. And we're pleased to present, this is the fifth in our sixth spring lecture series. And tonight we have with us Dr. Joanne Moyer, who will be talking about some of her research, both in Canada and in Kenya. And we also have with us a retired professor who was the Director of Environmental Studies and worked at King's for 25 years, just retired in September. So he's going to be introducing Dr. Moyer tonight. He's also going to be fielding questions. So if you have questions during the presentation, you can put them in the chat and Dr. Spallings will call on you. If you really want to ask the question out loud, you could also indicate that to him in the chat, and he can call on you after the lecture to unmute yourself and ask your question. If you could please be on mute throughout the evening. We'd love you to keep your cameras on so Dr. Moyer could see all your beautiful faces, but it's okay if you're not. And Carolyn, I do see you now, so you got that camera going. That's great. And we have lots of Dr. Moyer's family from all over the place. So welcome, Dr. Moyer's family. And Dr. Spallings, I'm going to hand things over to you if you want to unmute yourselves, and you're on.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Joanne Moyer to you all. Joanne hails from Lethbridge, Alberta, but has traversed across Canada as a student and visited many provinces, and also spent time in Africa as a child and later as a researcher. She has a Bachelor of Theology from the Canadian Mennonite Bible College in Winnipeg, a Bachelor of Arts in Environmental Studies from the University of Winnipeg, a Master of Environmental Studies from Dalhousie University in Halifax, and a PhD from the Natural Resources Institute at the University of Manitoba. I got to know Joanne during her PhD studies as a member of her thesis committee, and I visited her in Kenya, where she was researching how Christian development organizations were learning about and practicing environmental sustainability in their development work. And I'm sure that we'll hear more about that later this evening. After a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Toronto, Joanne came to the King's University in the year 2015. She is currently Associate Professor of Environmental Studies and Geography, and also Director of the Environmental Studies program at King's. Joanne is a person of faith who is passionate about creation care. As an academic, Joanne is intrigued by how faith communities understand and practice caring for God's creation. She publishes regularly in the field, including her book called Earth Trek, Celebrating and Sustaining God's Creation. But Joanne also practices her own passion. She's been an active member of the Mennonite Creation Care Network for some 15 years. On a personal level, Joanne practices voluntary simplicity. She has no car, travels by foot, bike, or public transit. For long distances, she prefers via rail over Air Canada. And Joanne also participates in the King's Community Garden. Joanne, we're looking forward to your presentation on working for God and sustainability, Tales from Two Continents.
Thank you very much, Harry, and thanks everyone for your presence and your attention tonight. So thank you for showing your faces. It's so lovely to see some of you who I haven't seen for a very, very long time. Shout out to Jim and Faith. So great to see you here. So I am actually, though, going to share my screen and show you lots of pictures, so then I won't be able to see very many of you anymore. So I'm going to do that now. There we go. Okay, so yeah, over the last decade and a bit, I have been researching faith-based environmental work, starting in Kenya, as Harry said, with my PhD research, and subsequently continuing the work here in Canada. And so this presentation will summarize this research, highlighting different approaches to creation care, just to kind of give you a taste what that kind of work can look like. and also explore where faith communities might have strengths and potential contributions, and where you may have some shortcomings in addressing the escalating environmental crisis. So first, I will talk about my PhD research. And so there I was working on a project studying learning for sustainability in the context of faith-based organizations, or FBOs, as I will sometimes refer to them, doing environmental and development work in Kenya. And as Harry said, this project was really special for me because I'd lived in East Africa as a child, and I'd been doing some volunteer work in my church through the Mennonite Creation Care Network on environmental issues. So it picked up on some really important pieces of my life. So just to kind of give some intro to why talk about these particular things, non-governmental organizations were chosen as the focus of the project because they're key players in working for development and environmental sustainability. And faith-based NGOs have historically been overlooked by both secular practitioners and academic scholars, leaving a gap in understanding. So we wanted to help figure out who are these organizations and what role are they playing in working towards sustainability. And Kenya was a great place to do this work because unfortunately it's faced with lots of serious environmental and development challenges. And also due to its geopolitical position in the region, many NGOs and FBOs are operating there and also have their head offices there. So as someone described it, Kenya is NGO heaven. So there are lots of people to work with there. This research was conducted in 2010 and 2011 based on interviews with a variety of organizations. And I also spent several months each with two case study organizations that I studied more intensively. That's where I was doing more of that learning piece that was sort of the focus of the project. I'm not going to talk about that tonight. I'll spare you all the theory. I'm just going to tell stories about their work. So these organizations were doing a wide variety of activities and working on a wide variety of issues, including agriculture and food, education and capacity building in a number of areas, forests, especially tree planting, health, especially HIV/AIDS, and social issues such as orphans and vulnerable children, and water, especially access and harvesting. So I'll illustrate these activities through a couple of examples. The first example is an organization called Care of Creation Kenya. This is a small faith-based organization focused primarily on deforestation, which is a huge problem in Kenya. And they also do some work promoting something called Farming God's Way, which is a Christian approach to conservation or no-till agriculture. So Care of Creation Kenya has a tree nursery with one of the largest collections of indigenous tree species in the country. They've got about 350 indigenous species. You can see some pictures there of their tree nursery. And basically they sell or donate the seeds and seedlings to mostly local institutions like schools and churches. And they also have an education program focusing on creation care. So giving presentations in churches, planning events for church leaders, and training creation care advocates. And in these pieces, they talk about the magnitude of the environmental crisis in Kenya and the church's responsibility to embrace and enact stewardship and sustainability principles. And Kenyans aren't always aware of all of these issues, but they can be very receptive if the message is packaged the right way. So they told me a couple of stories. One was that they'd done a conference with about 130 leaders from the Presbyterian Church of East Africa. And at the beginning of this conference, participants were sort of questioning, like they didn't get it. Why are we even here? Why are we talking about this? And by the end of the conference, they completely changed their minds and sort of collectively made a statement, which was basically, we repent, we get it now, we understand why this is so important. Also, after one of their God and creation conferences, the organization did a post-conference survey 6 months afterwards and found out that 1,500 trees had been planted in response. So again, evidence of sort of the success of the way that they're packaging their message. Another example is the Mennonite Central Committee. They have a number of projects in Kenya, but one of their flagship projects is building sand dams with a local organization called Utuoni Development. So they're operating in areas of Kenya that are very dry and suffer from water supply problems. Basically, the way the climate works in Kenya, especially in the really dry areas, is that the rain only comes maybe twice a year, some places only once a year, and then it rains every day for like a month. And then the rest of the year, there's no rain at all. And so then the rivers will only flow during the rainy season and they're dry all the rest of the time, which you can imagine makes it very hard for having a reliable water supply. So what they've done, I think this technology was first started in India, but what they do is they just build a cement dam across the riverbed, as you can see in the diagram there. And there's a picture of one in the photo. And when the rains come, the river is flowing violently, usually because it's lots of rain, and sand just collects up against that cement wall and it holds water. And it's this amazingly simple system where the water sits in the sand, it stays clean, doesn't breed mosquitoes that carry malaria, and it usually lasts until the next rains come because it's sort of protected by the sand from evaporating. And so much water will flow at once when the rains are falling that you can build many of these dams along one river and not really affect the volume of water flowing downstream. So it's a system that has very little negative impact on the landscape, but lots of positive impact for the people around. So these dams improve access to clean water. As you may know, in many parts of Africa, rural women have to walk long distances to get water every day, but with these dams, they can just go dig into the sand, or sometimes there's a pipe coming out, I think, and get the water there. They improve food security because they raise the water table in the area right around the dam, which means that more water dependent crops can be grown there. So you can see terraces drawn in on the diagram. And by increasing the variety of vegetation, they also increase bird and insect biodiversity in the area. So very cool project. Unfortunately, I didn't ever get to go see them. I just heard the people working on it tell me very enthusiastic stories about them. So that's MCC sand dams. Also, climate change is a big issue, urgent concern in Kenya, and there's some organizations working on that. So a large proportion of the population in Kenya is dependent on subsistence farming. And so this means that they grow most of their own food, have little money for buying extra. And as I said, the rainy season comes once or twice a year, and they're very dependent on that rain for their subsistence farming. Kenya has always had drought cycles, but in non-drought years, the rains were generally very reliable. In some areas, I was told they could predict when the rainy season would start by the date. Like the rain will start on March 15th or something. That's not the right date, but that's what they say, which is really bizarre coming from North America, where, you know, it can snow in January or snow in July, or it could be plus 10 in January, right? But in this tropical climate, it was usually very predictable. And so with climate change, rain is becoming much more unpredictable, and that makes it very difficult to farm and grow food to feed families. So dealing with climate change is very important in this context. So these two organizations, Norwegian Church Aid and Caritas Kenya, which is a Catholic organization, are taking a leadership role in climate change advocacy in Kenya. So they have done things like help build policy with the national government. They've supported them when they go to international meetings like the UN climate change meetings, help the Kenyan government delegates, help them to understand technical issues, that kind of thing. They're also working at public education, trying to make climate change understood at the village level, which is challenging since lots of people in countries like Canada, where we're way more educated, also have difficulty understanding how climate change works. So doing that kind of important work, and then also working on mitigation projects. So helping communities to adapt to the effects of climate change through things like alternative energy, planting trees, water management, that kind of thing. So now we'll get to the two case study organizations where I spent a bit more time, so I'll talk a little bit more about them. One of these was an organization called Arasha, and this is an international Christian conservation organization that started in Portugal in 1983 and then spread to other countries, including Kenya. I think, I'm trying to remember it. The project in Kenya started around 2000, I think. So in Kenya, they're located on the coast, as you can see there, where there are several areas of highly threatened biodiversity value, including the Arabuko-Sokoke Forest and Mita Creek. So there was once a large forest that covered the coast of East Africa from basically, if you can picture a map of Africa in your mind, from Somalia to Mozambique, there was this huge forest. And most of it is now gone, only small patches remain. And the Arabuko-Sokoke forest, which is in this area, is the largest remnant of that larger forest that's left. And it's about 420 kilometers squared. So the forest contains, because it's this patch of this sort of rare forest, it contains numerous rare and endangered species, including the golden rumped sengi, which is that mouse-like creature with the yellow bum, the adder's diker, which is the tiny deer there, the Sokoke Scops owl, and the spotted ground thrush. Also some elephants. The picture of the elephants is the only one that's actually mine. And we had, when I visited the forest, we had this very rare sighting, I was told, of these elephants. The Kenyans who were there all the time were really excited. So those are some of the animals that are dependent on this forest. And while the forest is legally protected, partially as a forest reserve and partially as a national park, it is still threatened primarily by illegal harvesting of wood, which is used as building materials and also sold as charcoal. So that's the forest. The other area that they're focused on is Mita Creek, which is not in fact a creek, but actually a tidal, containing a mangrove forest and serving as an important feeding area for turtles, fish, and shorebirds. And it is an important local source of food, but is being overfished despite being within the Watamu Marine National Park. So these were some of these areas were the reasons why Arusha located and started building projects in this area. So they do a number of things. They do scientific monitoring and research focused on birds and terrestrial and marine habitats in the area. So lots of things like bird banding, which you can see in the one picture, and bird counts. They also promote and provide training for Farming God's Way, which I mentioned earlier. And one of their main programs works at community conservation through ecotourism. So they have a program called the Arabuko-Sokoke Schools and Ecotourism Scheme, or ASSETS for short. And through this program, they raise money for a bursary fund to support local students attending secondary school. And they found when they located there, talking to the local people, a lot of the illegal harvesting and the charcoal selling was to raise money to send kids to secondary school. So hence this fund. And they raise money for the fund through partnerships with local tourist industries, international donors, including tourists, and some ecotourism facilities. So those steps there on the left hand of the side of the screen, that's a tree platform in the forest. You can go back here, there's this boardwalk through Mita Creek. And so tourists can pay a fairly small fee to enjoy those facilities. And then just to give you a sense of the area, the pictures on the other side of the screen are from the family farm of one of the beneficiaries of this ASSETS program. And then they also do environmental education with participating students and their parents in the ASSETS program, as well as around in schools. So that's Arusha. The other organization, oh, wait, I have one more thing to say about Arusha. They also raise, I'll go back, show you pictures. They also raise some of their money through the guest house, which is located on the beach, which I showed in my first picture of Arusha. It's a great place to stay. I'm just going to give a little commercial for them. It's a great place to stay if you're ever in Kenya looking for a kind of low-key beach vacation. And if you time it right, you might get to go along on a bird banding expedition, which is really cool. So that's Arusha. And then the Rural Service Program of the East Africa Yearly Meeting of Friends was the other organization that I spent a couple of months with. And this is the development arm of the Quaker Church in Kenya. So this is located in the Western Highlands, very different from the coast, less touristy, much more farming-based economy, because it's an area with really good agricultural land. It's fairly high elevation, right on the edge of the Rift Valley, good soil, generally reliable rainfall. But because of this favorable climate, it's an area with a very high population density. And so farming is being done very intensively. Farms are very small and fragmented because there are so many people. And so the soil is becoming depleted, even though it should be good soil, and is creating a threat to food security. So that sort of drives a lot of the work that this organization is doing. So their programs include agricultural extension and appropriate technology. So you can see here a picture of agroforestry where they're growing trees and maize together. They also have a number of programs that are working at renewing or protecting the soil. They were doing something called double digging, which I never quite understood what it was. They also have some appropriate technology programs, particularly looking at saving fuel for cooking. So the basket that you can see in the picture there is something called a fireless cooker, where this is really cool. You take your pot, boil up your beans or your rice, just get them to a boil, and then stick them in this very well insulated basket, and it will simmer until your food is done without any extra heat being added. So one fuel saving device. And then the other picture there is what's called a Brooder Stove. And so it's a highly efficient stove. You can cook your dinner with just 3 sticks. And underneath there's a safe space to put chicks that are brooding where they can stay nice and warm, but not too warm, and safe. So that's sort of the agricultural piece. They also had community health programs. So there's a picture there of a protected spring that's sort of got both sort of health pieces and also ecological pieces to it. Other health programs focused a lot on HIV/AIDS. They also have a microcredit program, which is community loans, and a number of special programs for widows and orphans, building houses, doing handcrafts, that kind of thing. And all of these programs are delivered through by facilitation through community-based groups. So the idea is to sort of get people involved in their own development work rather than having programs delivered to them by others. So youth groups, farmer field schools, widows groups were working on these projects with facilitation of rural service programs. So what did I learn from all of this? And of course, there were more organizations than these ones. I've just given you a sampling. So a couple of sort of summary learnings of what I discovered. First of all, faith-based organizations are playing a really big role in both development and environmental work in Kenya. And the faith-based approach is very appropriate in that context. Kenya is about 80% Christian, and the rest would be mostly Muslim or practicing traditional indigenous religions. And society is very spiritual and religious. So I'd go to government meetings and they would pray at the beginning, the way that we do at King's. And I also amuse myself by looking at slogans on things like public transportation vehicles that would say, God is able, emblazoned across the side, or businesses that would have names like God's Will Hair Salon and Glory Chemists. So, you know, it was a very, very faith-filled, imbued culture. And so in that context, faith-based organizations can speak in a language that people understand. Think of the farmers around Arabuko-Sokoke Forest. They're struggling to feed their families, send their children to school. You come in and talk to them about biodiversity and species extinction and that kind of thing. It's probably not going to resonate with them very much. But if you come and talk to them and say, you know, God made the world and God loves the world, and if we love God, we should care for the world that God made, that makes much more sense. And that's something that they can sort of get, that's a message that they can get excited about and committed to. Also, church or religious leaders are really trusted and respected. There's a lot of respect for authority and people will follow what they say. So doing things like training church leaders is a good approach. There's a story, this isn't from my research, but I read it elsewhere, but it's from the same region, from Zanzibar in Tanzania, where people were fishing with dynamite, which is really efficient for killing fish, but not very good for the rest of the habitat and other species. And so environmentalists tried to make them stop. The government tried to make them stop. Nothing worked until the imams went and asked them to stop, and then they stopped. So that's another example of sort of packaging the message through kind of the right channels. And then also churches and mosques are some of the only functioning social institutions, especially in villages. And this would be just because of the 80% Christian thing, mostly churches. So the government is seen as corrupt and untrustworthy, and there isn't really a strong secular civil society sector there. So churches are a really important entry point when trying to reach people in communities for development or environmental projects. And then finally, faith-based organizations can offer a more holistic message and often do a good, maybe better job at recognizing human and environmental needs together. So concluding all of that, I would say that faith-based organizations have great potential to act as social resources in what I would call the sustainability project in countries like Kenya because of their ability to build and use their social capital, meaning all of the social connections that give groups of people strength and resilience, and because of their relevance in the society and their ability to encourage transformative action in a holistic way. Now I will take a drink of water before going on to Canada. So coming out of this research, coming back to Canada, one of my questions was, how do faith-based organizations and faith communities function within a context like Canada's, which is much more secular and has strong secular social institutions? So since 2013, I've done several projects looking at faith communities in Canada to see how they're approaching environmental issues and related work. So I focused on two different kinds of organizations, and I'm going to jump back and forth talking about these two different kinds of organizations. So I hope I don't lose you in that process. So one is leadership organizations. So if we give an example from my denomination, that would be the staff and the Office of Mennonite Church Canada. That's the leadership organizations. And then faith-based organizations or FBOs, which are the agencies that are doing services or advocacy or that kind of thing. So that the companion in the Mennonite Church would be Mennonite Central Committee. So when I talk about leadership organizations, that's like the Anglican Church of Canada. When I talk about FBOs, that's MCC, World Renew, that kind of thing. Again, mostly collected my data through interviews, focus groups, attending events, and visiting sites. In the combined projects, I spoke to 16 FBOs and 16 leadership organizations. And I was trying to get more than just a Christian perspective very intentionally in this project or these projects, because most of the research on faith-based environmentalism has been done with a Christian focus. So the various organizations that I talked to over several projects represented 9 different faith traditions and 2 interfaith organizations, as you can see here. There were still lots of Christians. So I focused on a little more, 9 different denominations. And so you can see mostly leadership organizations here, as well as some of the related FBOs, and then some interdenominational or non-denominational umbrella leadership organizations and some other FBOs here. So that gives you a sense of all the different organizations I was talking to. So I'm going to start this Canadian section by telling a brief history of environmental engagement by faith communities in Canada. The earliest engagement at the sort of institutional or organizational level in Canada was in the late 1960s and then more into the 1970s. The first groups to get involved were the Unitarians and several Protestant denominations, so the United Church, Anglicans, Mennonites, and Lutherans, basically. And the early engagement was largely in the form of theological reflections and statements and resolutions. So basically, these groups were figuring out how these new problems related to the environment fit into the worldview framework of their faith and what they should do about it. Early engagement also happened through some of the faith-based organizations such as Citizens for Public Justice, Project North, and the Task Force on the Churches and Corporate Responsibility. So for example, they were deeply involved in the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline Inquiry in the 1970s in the Northwest Territories. advocating with Indigenous peoples. And it was actually, this is not very well known, but it was these organizations that originally suggested the 10-year moratorium on the project that was eventually adopted by that inquiry. In the 1980s and 1990s, some of those same Protestant denominations that I mentioned earlier, Unitarians and the Canadian Council of Churches, became more actively involved in issues such as acid rain, ozone pollution, ozone depletion, climate change, and also some resource issues such as forestry, mining, and fishing. There were also lots more statements and resolutions being developed during this time, and also the formation of some internal agencies and programs. And then the dissemination of lots of resources to educate and engage congregations. So some highlights from that period: the United Church and the Baha'is sent delegations to the Rio Summit in 1992. And in the late 1990s, numerous churches were advocating to government on climate change. And there was a big postcard campaign that was spearheaded by the Canadian Council of Churches to urge the government to sign the Kyoto Protocol. Into the 2000s, churches started losing resources because of a decline in membership and also because of costly court processes related to their involvement with Indian residential schools. And so staffing support was cut back, and some of these programs that had been happening earlier had to be cut. Consequently, the leadership organizations began relying more, and the community as a whole began relying more on the faith-based organizations and other partners to undertake this work. And there was actually quite a lot of growth, kind of early 2000s, in the formation of new environmentally focused FBOs. Despite these resource constraints, faith communities have continued to be involved in environmental issues in various ways. And looking at those activities over the last sort of 10 or 15 years, we can divide them into several basic categories. So one I would call formation. This is theological development, education work, and worship. And this is the area where the most activity is happening across different faith organizations and faith communities, which makes sense given what faith communities are and what they do. So in this category, largely what people are doing are creating or finding and then sharing resources. So books or pamphlets or whatever, talking about the theology of creation care, or however the wording works in their particular faith group. Resources for worship services and education time, so maybe Sunday school curricula. I've got the Green Khutbah campaign there. That was launched by Khalifa, which is this little Muslim website that's basically run by one guy in Toronto. And this campaign, which is sort of for an environmentally themed sermon for the Friday sermon around Earth Day, it went viral all over the world from this little website in Canada. So that was cool. A second area of activity is practical actions. So lots of communities are focusing on greening activities within congregations, energy efficiency of buildings, solar panels, recycling, waste reduction, community gardens, that kind of thing. And you can see examples of some programs here that church organizations have to support that work at the congregational level. And this is the area of engagement that's really taken off a lot in recent years. So you'll see more churches that have, or mosques or temples or whatever, that have solar panels or community gardens or that kind of thing. And then finally, several communities are also actively involved in advocacy campaigns. And this would be the area that probably has sort of the least or less activity than the other two. Much of this work in recent years has focused on climate change. Several communities, so the United Church, Mennonites, Christian Reform, Canadian Council of Churches, have sent representatives to UN climate meetings over the years. And an interesting example, the Christian Reform Church has a climate witness project that started to facilitate congregations to engage with the Paris talks in 2015. So those are some examples of advocacy. So those are kind of the activities that are being promoted and led by the leadership organizations. Faith-based organizations are doing some of the same things, but also some other things. So I'll give a couple of examples of those. Arasha also has a project in Canada, also started around the early 2000s with a field center along the Little Campbell River that you can sort of see in the picture there. It's a very tiny river in Surrey, BC. And that's where their primary operation still is, but they have developed centers in Manitoba and Ontario as well. So through their field centers, they do direct conservation work, monitoring birds and lots of fish as well, and also habitat restoration. So a cool story that happened at their property in BC, they found one day a kind of fish called the Salish Sucker. And it was thought to be extirpated in that region, but after they found it, then they got federal money to make the pond that you can see in the picture there into prime breeding habitat for both the Salish Sucker and salmon. So that's an example of habitat restoration. And then their other programs include education work, sustainable agriculture. They've got an internship program, and they also focus on intentional community and hospitality. That's common across Arasha projects. So you can visit and stay at field centers for a holiday, participate in conservation activities if you want to, or just enjoy the setting. Another organization is Greening Sacred Spaces. This was started by two United Church ministers who were working on developing interfaith dialogue, and they decided that the environment was a good area to focus that work and that dialogue. It was originally intended to be a national organization, but it's now mostly just in Ontario. They have lots of really good resources on their website that anyone can access, looking at or giving resources for how to green your sacred space. And in Ontario, they have animators in numerous communities who can help congregations start a green team in their church or mosque or temple, do energy and green audits of their buildings, set up solar panels, retrofit their building, or start a community garden, those kinds of things. So that's their focus. Then we have Kairos, which is based in Toronto with chapters across the country. This one was formed in 2001. So again, you see this theme of a whole bunch of them starting right in the early 2000s. And so they formed when a variety of interfaith coalitions, and I mentioned some of them earlier, like Project North, they all joined together into one organization with about 12 Christian denominations and organizations as members. They focus on social and ecological justice, and their current environmental activities, they do other things too, but their environmental activities are looking at climate change, watershed discipleship, which is sort of focusing on your local area, water issues, Indigenous rights, and some international development work. And they do largely education and advocacy work. So policy briefs, letter writing campaigns, that kind of thing. Similarly, is a similar organization is Citizens for Public Justice. They're also a national organization, and they started out as a justice organization with a focus on poverty and that kind of thing. But through work that I mentioned earlier with Indigenous peoples, especially the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline Inquiry in the 1970s, helped them to understand the link between people, the earth, and faith. And so now they continue to work on justice issues, housing, poverty, refugees, that kind of thing, but also do education and policy work about the environment in general and climate change in particular, as you can see in some of the images there. And I did want to give at least one example of a non-Christian organization. So Shoresh is a Jewish organization focused on food and farming in the Toronto area. They have some gardens and a farm. So gardens in Toronto, a farm near Guelph. They also have programs with schools, an outdoor ed program, sort of nature connections, that kind of thing. And their sort of big event is an annual food conference. So you can see some of the yummy food that we got to eat at this conference. And it's interesting listening to people debate things like, is biotechnology good if we can bioengineer pigs that Jews could eat so they could have bacon? That was one of the discussions at the food conference that I got to listen to. So interesting debates there. And then finally, this wasn't part of my research, but because it was just launched last year after my data collection was finished, But I wanted to quickly highlight this new initiative, which is a national collaborative initiative bringing together faith bodies and faith-based organizations in Canada to work at addressing climate justice through education, reflection, action, and advocacy. So a number of the organizations that I studied are involved with this For the Love of Creation initiative. And if you're interested in joining faith-based climate justice work, this is a good place to start. So now in the we're in the last section of the talk here. I'm going to talk a bit about the role that faith communities can play in the broader societal environmental movement. And when I talk about this part of the research in secular contexts, I'm trying to provide a window into faith communities that most people in the secular environmental world wouldn't necessarily be familiar with. So show them who we are, what our strengths and weaknesses are, how we can contribute, maybe why we're not contributing in the ways that they wish that we would. So when asked about their role or their strengths, overwhelmingly, the people that I talked to, the most common response was that the environmental crisis is a crisis of spirit and values, and that engaging, shaping, and transforming values and worldviews is fundamental to the work of faith communities. So this is the place that faith communities are sort of best positioned to contribute. A number of participants went further, asserting that as faith communities, they were better able to address deep existential questions than maybe secular NGOs or political processes. And so through the education and worship activities that I mentioned earlier, as well as theological work, faith communities are developing and sharing values, beliefs, and worldviews that provide an ethical and motivational framework for environmental engagement. And these frameworks seem to be used both within and beyond faith communities. Another strength is the strong organization and infrastructure that faith communities possess. Even in a country like Canada that's much more secular than, say, Kenya, faith communities still have large organized memberships that meet on a regular basis. And they also have experience working together on a wide variety of projects, from soup kitchens to refugee sponsorship to raising money to building education and medical institutions, just to name a few. So to do all of that, they've developed organizational infrastructure, and they've got administrative structures and agencies and staff and resources. And those can be mobilized for developing initiatives, disseminating messages through existing national and international networks to a built-in audience, and even encouraging participation in advocacy campaigns, though that happens a little bit less frequently. So just an example of what this can look like, in the 80s and 90s, when there were a lot of forestry disputes happening, well, now they're happening again, but at that time when there were a lot of forestry disputes happening, the task force on the churches and corporate responsibility and other groups were recognizing that there was a need for a forest certification program. And so this task force loaned one of their staff to the steering committee of what became the Forest Stewardship Council. You probably are familiar with the Forest Stewardship Council that you see on all kinds of paper products and wood products that you get. It's this big international certification body, and it came into being with infrastructure support from this little Christian coalition in Canada. So the next characteristic to talk about is both a strength and sometimes a limitation. And that's the theme of diversity, which surfaced repeatedly in interviews. Leaders of faith communities talked about encompassing very broad populations within their folds and the challenges and opportunities that brings. FBOs talked about serving broad populations and working to be relevant to, for instance, Jews whose expression of Jewishness is primarily cultural, across the spectrum to very conservative or Orthodox Jews. And a number of them also talked about how they were broadening their audience, especially Christian FBOs, broadening their audience and membership in recent years beyond the narrow denominational group that founded them. And finally, there's also a clear trend towards increasing interdenominational and interfaith collaboration. And so all this diversity presents opportunities for really lively and rich conversations, but also potential for conflict and disagreement. The resources that I mentioned earlier potentially allow faith communities to act rapidly on environmental issues, but they don't always act very quickly, and sometimes they don't act at all. So now I'm going to talk about some of the barriers and challenges that shape how faith communities engage with environmental issues. And one of these barriers is contextual. Many Christian denominations have experienced a decline in church attendance and membership in recent decades, as I discussed earlier. And so consequently, both financial and human capacity have been reduced, and the environment is competing with many other worthy causes and concerns. And this is happening in the communities that have historically been the most active and organized. So that's kind of a threat to this work in Canada. At the same time, many other communities, for example, Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, those kinds of groups, are less well established and have communities composed of a lot of recent immigrants. So they're typically occupied with building their organizations, settling their members in Canada, and helping them integrate into Canadian society, as you can see by the screenshot there from the World Sikh Organization of Canada. Another barrier has to do with decision-making processes that guide a number of faith communities. And this is especially in the Christian leadership organizations, which are larger, typically have complex structures, and people talked about having really slow-moving and time-consuming decision-making processes because they value participation, careful discernment, and consensus through various levels of their organization. And as I mentioned earlier, these communities have broad and diverse populations, which further contributes to the complexity of this decision-making model. So for instance, a national church body like the Anglican Church that I've shown here may have congregations in Fort McMurray, Alberta, and Burnaby, BC, which makes crafting a position on the Trans Mountain Pipeline, for instance, very challenging. The most well-known barrier to environmental engagement, particularly for Christians, is theological. And there are a number of theological objections to environmental engagement that range from concerns about slipping into paganism, to prioritizing saving souls, to assuming that God gave humans the world to use as they please, and end times expectations that the world is just going to burn anyways, so it doesn't matter what we do to it. These types of challenges certainly surfaced in my interviews, but not as frequently as you might expect. But within the faith communities where these concerns are present, people who are working to advance environmental concerns must move very carefully and often need to put a lot of work laying a biblical and theological foundation before they can proceed to meaningful actions. So that again is something that slows down the process if they can overcome those theological objections at all. To end on a positive note, a final strength, environmental work is often discouraging and draining, and finding hope can be hard, but many proponents of faith-based environmentalism have argued that providing a source and spiritual resilience may be the greatest contribution that faith-based approaches can make to the sustainability movement. And I certainly saw evidence of this within my research. People talked about finding hope through their faith in a higher power and their sense of being part of a much larger project that doesn't depend entirely on them. They talked about spiritual elements within their faith traditions and rituals that provide access to spiritual power, and also finding hope in the community gathered to work together on these difficult projects or problems. So, some summarizing conclusions. First, looking at the leadership organizations. The typical narrative is that Christian churches in particular, and faith communities in general, are behind the rest of society in addressing environmental concerns. And to some extent, this is true. But these findings demonstrate that some faith communities, at least, have been involved for almost as long as the environmental movement has existed. Leaders would be the Unitarians, the United Church, Anglicans, Mennonites, Lutherans, Baha'is, and the United Church deserves special mention, particularly because of the work of David Hallman. He worked for the United Church from 1979 to 2007 on environmental, climate, and energy files, and also worked part-time for the World Council of Churches, and he played an extremely important leadership role in faith communities in Canada and around the world. Some laggers and slow starters would be evangelical churches and those communities with more recent immigrants, some of whom aren't doing much of anything at all. Others are just starting to explore how they can get engaged, especially at the top leadership level. And then finally, congregational activity or congregational level activities are also key. Various initiatives that were happening at the leadership level were initiated from the grassroots, and much of the practical greening that I talked about earlier is taking place at that level. Looking at the FBOs, they're mostly somewhat fringe organizations that struggle to accomplish their aims with few staff or financial resources, but within those circumstances, they're doing very good work. And they're playing some interesting roles. One is that they are adopting holistic approaches that link human and ecological justice concerns in a really important way. They're also working to create model alternative communities. So they're sort of experimenting with and demonstrating a way of living out ecological ethics grounded in faith. So on the whole, there's great potential among environmentally engaged FBOs, and they are leading their communities in this work. So I've come to the end. I hope I've given you some encouraging insight into faith-based environmental work and maybe inspired you to get involved with one of these initiatives. Before we open for questions, I would like to thank all the organizations and people within them that let me spend time with them and ask them lots of questions, as well as my mentors and colleagues and research assistants.
Thank you, Joanne. And there's Kathleen has just reminded you on the chat function, if you have a question, please send it directly to me. And if even if you prefer to ask your question directly, do that as well to let me know that you have a question, and I'll try to manage the questions that way as well. Just to help us off a bit with some questions, Joanne, I'll maybe give a little bit of a tidbit of history that I'm quite sure you know, because this came up in your thesis at my prodding. So maybe this is going down memory lane a little bit, but the term sustainable development is often thought of as originating from the secular environmental community, and in particular from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. They wrote a document called the World Conservation Strategy in 1980, and they popularized the term sustainable development. What very few people know is that the term sustainable development was actually coined a few years earlier through the World Council of Churches in a program called Peace, Justice, and the Integrity of Creation. So the faith community, as Joanne said, has a long history in the environmental movement, including coining some of the language that is now become popular usage. So the term sustainable development actually was used, was coined by the faith community, a global faith community, in this case, the World Council of Churches. So I'll just throw that in as a little historical tidbit. And Joanne, if you want, you don't have to respond, but I'll give you the opportunity.
No,
if you'd like
well,
to.
I can add to that. So not only that, but also I cut this out for time. It was in the presentation in an earlier iteration, but when I was talking about worldviews and how faith communities can build these worldview frameworks that aren't just used within the faith community itself, that's an example of that. Another example is the idea and the term climate justice. So now you hear that all over the place. Greenpeace talks about it. There's a group called Climate Justice Edmonton. But if you go back, and various of the people that I talked to said, you know, we're the ones, the faith communities are the ones that started talking about climate justice. We're the ones who started linking climate change and its human impacts and not just talking about polar bears. And this is something that at some point I would love to work with a student doing some research to kind of track that and find more evidence for it than just people saying it was us who did this. But I do have one little piece of evidence. When I was at a conference, a geography conference, I think, I was chatting with someone, a professor from the University of Waterloo, about my work. And she said, you know, I was part of this project in the mid-90s where we were looking for Environment Canada. We were looking at several different organizations doing climate change work and sort of analyzing their approach. And so she mailed me the paper report from 1995. And they looked at 3 different organizations, I think Friends of the Earth, another secular NGO, I can't remember what it was, and the United Church of Canada under the leadership of David Hallman, who I mentioned. And that's exactly what I saw in this report, was that the 2 secular NGOs were just talking about habitat destruction and that kind of thing in relation to climate change, but the United Church was talking about the social justice piece as well. So an interesting, I'm sure there are more stories like that out there.
Joanne, could you say a little bit about what perceptions secular environmental organizations have of faith-based organizations who are concerned about and acting on creation care? So I'm thinking, would you describe it as, do they embrace it? Do they accommodate faith-based organizations? Or are they kind of resistant, reluctant to it? Just to use 3 categories, you can add others, but could you say a little bit about that?
So I will preface this by saying that my response is fairly anecdotal because I haven't done systematic research on this, but just from my experiences and stories that people have told. So when I started my PhD at the University of Manitoba doing this Kenyan work, one of the professors came up to me, like in my first year, within the, might have been the first couple of weeks that I was there, and said, Christians are the reason we have these problems, but Mennonites are okay. And I was like, thank you. So that's one example of a response. Another would be Arusha in BC has been doing some partnership work with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. So they have this, I think they have this thing called the Ugly Bug Ball, which is, I think, a sort of celebratory event of some kind for the department. And they host it at Arusha. And so the Arusha folks talked about how hesitant and skeptical these government environmental folks were when initially developing this relationship. They thought these people were going to be weird and they were very hesitant. But as the relationship unfolded, it's turned into a really good relationship. So in general, I would say a lot of people in the secular world have this assumption that Christians in particular are not doing anything or are actually creating problems. And then when they discover some of these organizations and the projects that they're working on, are pleasantly surprised. But I would say lots of them haven't encountered these organizations and haven't had the chance to be pleasantly surprised yet.
Well, that's like a challenge for those of us involved in faith-based organizations and creation care to spread our good work. I'm just a reminder, I'm inviting people to send in their questions. Please do that using the chat. I would certainly welcome that. Joanne, I'll ask another as we wait for a few questions. When you've talked about Kenya and Canada, and the narrative that exists with NGOs, faith-based Christian development organizations, and so on in Kenya is sometimes, it's overly simplified, but I'll say it's poverty versus the environment. We can't deal with the environment because poverty is too urgent. The narrative in Canada is usually phrased something like it's jobs versus the environment. jobs are the priority and the economy is the priority, and so I just wondered if that's a really broad, I have a very broad question, but how can we get out of that sort of dualistic thinking, and is there a role for the faith-based environmental organizations and the church more broadly to help us get over those narratives in both of those places that you've had some experience now?
Well, I think it was a lot easier in Kenya, at least from what I encountered. It seemed like people there were at the point where they were realizing that they couldn't separate poverty from the environmental issues. I mean, if you need wood to cook your food and you've cut down all the forests and have no wood, then you have nothing to cook your food with, right? So it was very, very obvious. And I found one of the things that I came away from that experience in Kenya with feeling hopeful about was just all the creative things that people were doing to use environmentally focused projects to overcome poverty and to improve conditions. And I kept thinking, why can't we have this attitude here? Like I mean, I was obviously in a bubble talking to all these organizations that were working on this stuff, but there seemed to be so much enthusiasm and creativity happening there. And I, in a way in Canada, I feel like it's not desperate enough yet. So we're not deploying our creativity in the way that we could. But I think the same opportunity exists here to, and I mean, many people have said this, that alternative energies will actually create more jobs than the energy infrastructure that we have right now. Maybe not such extremely high paying jobs for a small number of people, but possibly more good, secure jobs. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but those are my initial thoughts thinking about that.
Great, thank you. I'll give a moment to see if anyone has a question. I do have a question in the chat that I can ask. So I'll give you the opportunity, audience, to pose a question if you wish. Joanne, there's a question about, and I know you know the answer to this one, how is King's incorporating some of the greening strategies, and how is King's being, let's say, a faithful environmental steward and its practices?
Well, yeah, lots of ways. I mean, we try to, as you know, we try to deploy our students to do this as much as possible. So we try to find ways of incorporating greening the campus into their work and their courses, especially in the senior capstone course. There's a long history of doing group projects in that class, and there's a long history of working on campus sustainability pieces there. And we've worked closely with the, I think now former director of facilities, who was really enthusiastic about this kind of thing. So he did, sort of what our colleague John Wood calls the hidden curriculum of the infrastructure of the campus. And so I actually used to get Rob to come and give a tour with my intro students, and we'd walk around the campus and he would tell them about, I changed these light bulbs and these light bulbs, and I did this to this air duct system, and I didn't understand the technicalities of most of it, but he was saving all kinds of energy and water and stuff with all these things that he was doing that you don't know unless somebody tells you, because you can't tell what kind of light bulb is up in that light system. We have a community garden, we have solar panels, we have a car charging station. We just did again, well, we haven't submitted it yet. We're close to submitting a sustainability tracking and rating system report that is created for university campuses. So we did that again with a student as a project over this winter. So it's a way that we can sort of assess our overall campus, not just the facilities, but our courses and all kinds of things, And then if we're running it regularly, which I haven't always had the capacity to do, but then we can sort of track ourselves over time and see, are we improving? Where are areas that we can improve? Where are the easy areas that we can improve? Where are the harder areas that we can improve? That kind of thing. So those are a couple of things. You might know others that I missed, Carrie. You can add more. Oh, right. Yes, the tree planting initiative, Heather just put into the chat. Yes, we've just started planting a bunch of trees on campus too.
And also there's been a study looking at the carbon footprint of universities, all universities in Canada, and King's participated in that. And King's had the lowest carbon footprint on a per student basis of any university in Canada. So that was also a good achievement over the years, mostly resulting from energy efficiency. And it helps, of course, that we're a campus all under one roof. We don't have separate buildings and so on. Joanne, back to Kenya for a minute. You know, I'm thinking that people want to may have some questions, just sort of personal questions. Like, give us what was your highlight? What was your best moment in Kenya, or some wow moments? What did you really enjoy about being there? And tell us how long you spent there.
Okay.
And what were some really highlight moments for you?
Well, it was 10 years ago, but I've actually just been rereading my journals over the last couple of months from that period. Mostly this started because my parents, who came out to visit me when I was there, just won this picture book thing, and were putting together a picture album from that trip when they came to visit me, and kept asking me, what was this thing? What was that animal? So then I started looking this up in my journal and rereading. And so now I'm trying to, it was a while ago though, trying to remember highlights. So I was there for first about 3 months. So I went in January 2010 and then came back in about March. And that first session, I was mostly in Nairobi, but did a couple trips to Arusha and Rural Service Program just to identify them as my case studies. Came back for about 6 months, went back in September 2010, and stayed till April 2011. So highlights. Well, Arusha, one shouldn't have favorites of one's research participants or something, I guess, but hanging out at Arusha was just so cool. You maybe could tell from my presentation, I just love this organization. They are such warm people, and I had such fun staying at that field station and guest house, and going bird banding was pretty cool. So, I mean, this was interesting because I had done quite a number of interviews before I got to go when they were bird banding at Meeta Creek. And I should also give a bit more context. My parents, who are here, love bird watching. I have very poor eyesight. I can never see the birds. Not my favorite thing. I can't tell what's going on. So I go to this bird observatory organization, and everyone's just talking about birds all the time. And I was like, oh my goodness, the birds. And then I got to go on this bird banding expedition, or this thing, in about November. So I've been there for several months already. So what they do is they set up the nets before the sun goes down in this inlet, this tidal inlet, and there are nets at several spots, and on a moonlit night so that they can see. And then as the tide comes in, these shorebirds sort of fly along with the tide to where just like the shallow water is. And then as they're flying, they get caught in the nets. So then you would wade out, remove the birds from the nets, put them in little cloth sacks, carry them back to our little station, put them into these little hutches. And then the people who knew what they were doing were sitting there doing the banding and the measurements. And the rest of us would pick birds out of the hutches, hold them ready, exchange with a bird that was banded, and then take the banded bird back to the beach, make sure it could walk, because that would indicated that it should be okay to also fly, make sure that they were okay, and then watch them go on their way. So here I am in the dark in Kenya holding a live wild bird in my hand, and you can smells like fish and you can feel its heart beating. And I was like, oh, I get it now. I get why everyone is talking about how amazing this is. And so that was a real personal highlight. And also, as I was thinking about learning in the theoretical part of the research, realizing this is why experiential learning is so important, because I didn't get this until I could experience with all my senses. I had to be here to understand how significant this particular activity is. So that's one highlight.
Great, thank you. And I can just also put in a plug for Arusha, Kenya, because it has been a great partner for King's beyond Joanne's work. We have had students from King's, either students at King's, but more typically who have gone on to do their master's degree. And they have also been based at Arusha, Kenya, staying at the very same place Joanne did, doing their research through the same institute, the Natural Resources Institute at the University of Manitoba, where Joanne studied. So we have had various alum from King's go on to do graduate work and do their field work in Kenya. It's through Arusha, Kenya. So it's been a great partner for us over the years. It is just getting to be almost quarter after. We're getting very close to our time. I think I should hand it over to Kathleen for any closing comments. And but first, let me just say, Joanne, thank you very much for your presentation. And I really appreciate the last slide you had, which was about hope and spiritual resilience. And that's just, I think, what is exactly the core and the strength of the faith-based community and the church more broadly, that it has to offer to the caring for creation need and mandate that the scriptures give to all of us. So thank you very much for sharing your story personally, but also your academic research. Much appreciated. Kathleen, I'll hand it over to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Harry. Thanks, Joanne. That was so interesting. And if you know how to use the little chat reactions, you could give like a hand clap there at the bottom for the presentation today. And Joanne, I'm impressed with how many organizations that you studied and worked with, and how many denominations and stuff. That was really good. And I'll have to ask you later. I realize there might be some more mutual friends that we have in common. Joanne and Harry, maybe this is a question for both of you. I'm looking around the chat room and there's not too many folks that are university age, but if people wanted to go to Kenya and do something like this, is there like an adult kind of trip that could be planned maybe by you guys?
Well,
you organize it and I'll go.
Okay,
yeah,
okay.
right. My first answer to that would be that go to Arusha. Like they have an internship program for young adults, but I think anybody can go be an intern. You do have to pay to be an internship. You have to pay to stay there because that's one of the ways they sort of get their funds. But that's a much cheaper way to be in Kenya than other things, but that would be my suggestion. Go volunteer at Arusha, Kenya, if you want to have an experience in Kenya.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, and I can add that Kenya is a wonderful place to go as a tourist, to go on a safari, for example, and it's easy to organize through a travel agent, even as a couple or a single person, for example. But what I would encourage you to do is, if you took that approach, to take a side trip and add a bit of time, like Joanne is saying, and visit Arusha. They have accommodation. They're on the coast, and you can participate in some of their activities as an observer, as a participant. That is something that they're set up for. Or alternatively, perhaps you have a church connection that can also get you to see some of the work that they do, whether it's World Renew or MCC or another denomination. Those are also sometimes possibilities. So certainly would do that. And Kathleen, if you want to organize a King's trip, I'll be the first one to sign up and deliver on the Kenya end.
Perfect.
Me too,
folks.
Well, I would add to that, like I know MCC has learning tours in Kenya as well as other places. And Arusha, they love birds so much, they will teach anyone everything they know about birds. So especially if you like birds, go to Arusha.
Perfect. I did notice that out in Sherwood Park, there's a bird observatory somewhere out here, and that was going to be one of my goals for this summer. So Joanne, we've got a date planned. We're going birding. Several of you have asked about a recording for this, and I did notice the BC folks all signing in around 8 o'clock with the confusion over a time change. So yes, all of our lectures are recorded, and they are up on our King's YouTube page. You might have to do King's University Edmonton YouTube page, because there is another King's University. And Joanne's will be up next week sometime once we do a little bit of editing on it. So just hold off for a few days. We do have Dr. Brian Martin here online with us, who is going to give just a 2-minute commercial about the 6th and the last in the series that we're doing for these spring lectures. So Dr. Martin, are you on here?
If I unmute myself, you could probably hear me.
There you are.
There we are, yes. Well, thank you for inviting me. And yes, the lecture is not going to be what you expect. It's not going to be a science lecture with lots of math in it. And it's going to be an invitation to just enjoy the sense of wonder that we get from the nighttime sky, and especially that wonder as it's brought to us through the work of visual artists, poets, and musicians. So it's astronomy and the muse, and it will really be just I've often described it to people, this is more a devotion than a science colloquium or talk. So we will listen to both some classical and contemporary music that is motivated by astronomical themes. We will look at some just a small set of poets who have in beautiful ways captured some of the real subtleties and the ideas of astronomy. And we will look at some visual artists. Two of particular note would be Edvard Munch and this Dutch guy named Van Gogh that some of you may have heard of. I will end the discussion with actually a look at Van Gogh and how his astute observation of the nighttime sky is seen in his paintings. So I hope it's something that you will enjoy. I think Jeff Dudiak is going to also field all the difficult questions for me. Isn't that what we agreed upon? Something like that.
Yeah.
And there will be an opportunity at the end if people want to actually, explore some of the ideas in astronomy that they have questions about. I'd be more than happy to also answer that. But my real intention here is not to make this a science lecture as much as something that we can all just, I hope, feel a little bit inspired by and come away with a sense of wonder.
Perfect.
That's my 2-minute commercial. How'd I do?
Great job. Thank you very much. Well,
okay.
Thank you everyone for coming out and joining us tonight. And we welcome you to join us next week again with Dr. Brian Martin. Have a great night, and hopefully we'll see you all next week.